For over a century, the government of the United States ran almost entirely on money collected at the docks. No income tax withheld from a paycheck, no April filing deadline, no IRS reaching into a worker's wages. For generation after generation, the federal government that built roads, fought wars, purchased territories, and pushed a nation from coast to coast, funded nearly all of it through a single source: a tax collected the moment a ship's cargo touched an American port. Today, income tax is so woven into American life that most people cannot imagine a country without it. It arrives from every paycheck, every quarter, every April. It feels less like a policy choice and more like a fact of nature, as permanent as the seasons. It was not always this way. For roughly the first 125 years of this nation's existence, there was no federal income tax at all, not in any meaningful, lasting sense. And for long stretches of that era, tariffs collected at America's ports supplied as much as 90% of everything the federal government spent. 90%. An entire national government, funded almost entirely by a tax on goods crossing into American harbors. So how did a nation run itself for over a century on nothing but a tax at the border? And if that system worked well enough to fund a government for 125 years, why does almost no one alive today remember it existed at all? Before you hear the answer, consider something simple. If your government today collected almost no income tax, and instead funded itself entirely through prices you paid at the store on foreign-made goods, would you even notice? Would that feel more fair to you or less? Hold on to that thought. The easy assumption is that tariffs were always a minor background detail of American economic policy, a small technical tax quietly adjusted by economists and largely ignored by ordinary citizens, never a matter serious enough to dominate a presidency or reshape the nation's politics. It is a comforting, unremarkable picture. It is also almost entirely wrong, because tariffs were not a minor footnote in American finance. They were, for most of the 19th century, essentially the entire financial engine of the United States government. The U.S. Customs Service, an agency almost no American today could name, was, for decades, the primary tax-collecting arm of the entire federal government, more central to Washington's finances than nearly anything else that existed. Every dollar spent on the army, on new territory, on the earliest infrastructure of an expanding republic, very often traced back to a customs officer standing on a dock, assessing a duty on cargo unloaded from a foreign ship. This was not a footnote. This was the foundation, and here is where the story turns dark and far more dangerous than most people realize. A tax that funds an entire national government inevitably becomes a tax that decides who wins and who loses inside that nation. Tariffs did not fall on everyone equally. They protected certain industries in certain regions, while quietly punishing entire other regions that had no such industries to protect at all. For over a century, that imbalance simmered beneath the surface of American politics, sometimes as a minor irritation, and at other times as an open, furious grievance capable of shaking the Union itself. Hi, viewers. If the government you lived under collected almost no tax from your paycheck at all, would you actually want that, or does it sound too good to be true? Tell us what you think in the comments, because it is too easy, looking back from today, to imagine early American tariffs as some dry, bloodless matter of customs paperwork, a policy debated calmly in the halls of Congress and forgotten by everyone else. The reality was almost the opposite. Tariffs sparked some of the most furious political battles of the entire 19th century. They pitted region against region, industry against industry, and eventually, one part of the country against the very authority of the federal government itself. What most Americans do not know, what has been almost entirely erased from popular memory, is that this boring system of funding the government through tariffs nearly tore the United States apart. Not during the Civil War. 3 decades before it, an American state would openly declare a federal tax law null and void within its own borders. A sitting president would prepare to send federal troops into that state to enforce the law by force if necessary, and the Union, the very Union that a civil war would later be fought to preserve, came closer to fracturing over a tax on imported goods than most Americans have ever been taught to imagine. That crisis is where this story must begin. Because to understand why America eventually abandoned the very system that built it, you first have to understand a world where the government did not simply collect its money at the border, it staked its survival on that money being collected at all. The story of American tariffs does not begin in a moment of crisis. It begins with the very first breath of the federal government itself. In 1789, before the United States even had a working system of federal courts, before it had a standing army worth the name, the very first Congress in American history passed one of its earliest laws, a Tariff Act. It was not an afterthought. It was, in many ways, the foundation everything else would be built on. A new nation, still deeply in debt from the Revolutionary War, needed money simply to exist, and there was no other reliable mechanism yet in place to raise it. The man behind this vision was Alexander Hamilton, the young, brilliant, relentlessly ambitious first Secretary of the Treasury. In 1791, Hamilton delivered a document to Congress that would shape American economic policy for well over a century, his Report on Manufactures. In it, he argued something that seems almost obvious now but was radical at the time. Tariffs should not just raise money. They should be used deliberately as a tool to nurture young American industries against the overwhelming competition of British manufacturers who could produce goods cheaper and sell them for less. Protect the infant factories now, Hamilton argued, and in time they would grow strong enough to compete with anyone. Hamilton was not naive about the danger in this approach. Even as he championed tariffs, he warned that leaning too heavily on them could quietly force ordinary people to prop up the profits of a favored few, a warning almost no one in power would remember a few decades later, when that exact danger came roaring to life. For the young republic, this system worked with almost startling simplicity. Ships from Europe would sail into American harbors, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, loaded with manufactured goods. A customs officer would meet them at the dock, assess a duty on the cargo, and collect it before a single crate was allowed onto American soil. Multiply that transaction across dozens of ports and thousands of ships, year after year, and you have, almost unbelievably, the primary financial engine of an entire nation. Picture what this actually looked like on the ground. In the earliest decades of the Republic, customs duties supplied as much as 90% of everything the federal government spent. Before the War of 1812, that number was nearly universal. There was no vast bureaucracy of tax collectors reaching into every American household. There was no internal revenue system worth the name. The government of the United States, in its infancy, was funded almost entirely by men standing on wooden docks, weighing crates of imported cloth, iron, and glassware, and writing down a number. This was not a burden most ordinary Americans felt directly, or at least not in a way they could easily see. No one opened an envelope demanding a portion of their wages. The tax was folded invisibly into the price of an imported coat, a set of English china, a roll of French silk, paid, in effect, every time a consumer bought something manufactured overseas rather than at home. It was, in a strange way, one of the most painless taxes a government could levy. You never saw the government's hand in your pocket. You simply saw a slightly higher price tag on the shelf. Hi viewers, does it surprise you that early America ran on a tax that almost nobody had to think about paying directly? Let us know in the comments. For merchants and ship owners along the eastern seaboard, tariffs were simply the water they swam in, an unavoidable cost of doing business, adjusted by Congress every few years, argued over in newspapers, but rarely a matter of true political fury. For a northern factory owner, tariffs were something closer to a gift, a wall of protection that let a young American mill sell its cloth for a competitive price against cheaper British imports flooding the market. Investment poured into New England textile mills, into Pennsylvania ironworks, into the earliest stirrings of American industry, buoyed by a government policy that made foreign competition just a little more expensive year after year. But travel south, away from the smokestacks of the North and into the cotton fields of Georgia, Alabama, and South Carolina, and the picture of this same system looked entirely different. The agrarian South manufactured almost nothing of what it consumed. It grew cotton, and it grew tobacco, and it shipped both across the ocean to be sold on the world market, and in exchange, it imported nearly everything else: tools, cloth, furniture, machinery. Every dollar of tariff protection that helped a Massachusetts mill owner sell his cloth also meant a Georgia planter paid more for the very same cloth, with no domestic industry of his own being protected in return. The tariff that built up one region of the country was, quite literally, extracting wealth from another, a policy that looked, to Southern eyes, less like national growth and more like a tax on the South to subsidize the North. For years, this imbalance simmered as an irritation rather than an emergency, a grievance aired in Congress, grumbled about in Southern newspapers, but never quite serious enough to threaten the fabric of the young nation. That would not last, because a tariff that quietly favors one region over another does not stay quiet forever. Sooner or later, the region paying the price starts asking exactly how much more it is willing to pay, and in 1828, Congress was about to answer that question in the worst possible way, pushing tariff rates to levels the South would not simply grumble about. They would call it something else entirely, an abomination, and the fury it unleashed would bring the United States closer to armed conflict between a state and its own federal government than almost any other single issue in the years before the Civil War itself. In 1828, Congress passed a tariff so aggressive, so nakedly protective of Northern manufacturing, that Southerners gave it a name that has outlived nearly everyone who lived through it. They called it the Tariff of Abominations. The numbers alone tell part of the story. Duties on raw materials and manufactured goods jumped by 30 to 50% almost overnight. For a northern manufacturer, this was a windfall, a wall of protection thick enough to keep out nearly all serious foreign competition. For a southern planter, it was closer to an assault. His region produced almost nothing the tariff protected, and imported nearly everything the tariff now made more expensive. Worse, European nations that bought Southern cotton began retaliating against American trade policy with tariffs of their own, striking directly at the South's chief export and its entire economic foundation. The South did not simply grumble this time, it organized. At the center of the fury stood John C. Calhoun, a South Carolinian, a former nationalist, and, in one of the more remarkable twists of this story, the sitting Vice President of the United States. Calhoun anonymously authored a pamphlet called the South Carolina Exposition and Protest, laying out a legal theory that would soon push the country toward the edge of a genuine constitutional crisis. If a state believed a federal law was unconstitutional, Calhoun argued, that state possessed the right to declare the law null and void, simply refuse to enforce it within its own borders. The doctrine had a name that would soon dominate headlines across the country: nullification. For years, this remained mostly theory, debated in speeches and essays. Then, in 1832, everything changed. Congress passed a new tariff that year, trimming some of the worst excesses of 1828, but preserving its essential protectionist core. For South Carolina's most determined nullifiers, it was not nearly enough. In November of 1832, a special state convention gathered in Columbia, South Carolina, and did something no American state had ever formally done before. It passed an ordinance of nullification, declaring the federal tariffs of both 1828 and 1832, in the convention's own words, null, void, and no law, within the borders of South Carolina. The ordinance went further still, threatening that if the federal government attempted to enforce the tariff by force, South Carolina would consider secession from the Union itself. This was no longer a policy disagreement. This was a state, in writing, daring the federal government of the United States to try to collect a legally passed tax. President Andrew Jackson, a Southerner himself, a slaveholder, a man who had spent much of his political life championing states' rights, did not hesitate. He regarded South Carolina's defiance not as principled dissent, but as something far more dangerous. Jackson had already broken bitterly with Calhoun over a string of earlier disputes, and now, with the Union itself apparently on the line, he drew a line no ambiguity could soften. Disunion by armed force, Jackson declared flatly, is treason. Privately, to his Secretary of War, he was blunter still, vowing to crush what he called the monster before it could grow any larger, and reportedly making clear he was prepared to see Calhoun and other nullifiers hanged for treason if it came to that. Jackson asked Congress for the legal authority to enforce the tariff with military force if necessary, and Congress obliged, passing what became known as the Force Bill, a law explicitly granting the president the power to use the U.S. military to collect duties in South Carolina by whatever means required. Meanwhile, South Carolina's new governor began quietly mobilizing men and arms, preparing, at least in theory, to defend the state's defiance by force. For a tense stretch of the winter of 1832 into 1833, the United States stood closer to armed conflict between a state and its own government than at almost any point before the Civil War itself, 3 full decades before Fort Sumter, over the exact same fundamental question of whether a state could defy federal authority and, if pushed far enough, leave the Union altogether. This is the plot twist most Americans never learn about their own country's tariff history. It was never simply a technical policy, adjusted quietly by economists in the background of American life. It was a fuse, one that had already been lit once, decades before the Civil War, by the very system that funded the federal government. The crisis did not end in bloodshed. Kentucky Senator Henry Clay, working behind the scenes with Calhoun himself, engineered a compromise tariff that would gradually reduce rates over the following decade. Congress passed both bills on the very same day in March of 1833, the Force Bill granting Jackson his war powers, and Clay's compromise tariff diffusing the immediate crisis that had made those powers seem necessary in the first place. South Carolina, having secured a gradual tariff reduction, repealed its nullification ordinance and stood down. Jackson, having proven the federal government's willingness to use force if truly pushed, declared victory of his own. The Union held. But something had changed that could not be undone. For the first time, a state had formally linked the ideas of nullification and secession, arguing not just that a state could ignore a federal law it opposed, but that it might leave the Union entirely rather than obey. That idea did not disappear when South Carolina stood down in 1833. It went dormant, waiting, embedded now in the political imagination of an entire region, ready to resurface, 3 decades later, over a far graver question than the price of imported cloth. For the rest of the 19th century, the tariff question never truly went away. It simply changed its shape. After the Civil War reshaped the balance of political power decisively toward the industrial North, tariff rates climbed and stayed high for decades, propping up American manufacturing and continuing to fund the overwhelming majority of the federal government's operations. And in 1890, that system reached a new, almost absurd extreme. That year, Congress passed the McKinley Tariff, named for the Ohio congressman who championed it, a man who would later become president in no small part because of the very policy now bearing his name. The McKinley Tariff pushed average duty rates up by roughly 50%, among the highest protective rates the nation had ever seen. Its architects promised it would supercharge American industry. What it delivered, in the short term, was fury. Prices on everyday goods, tinware, clothing, basic household items, climbed noticeably almost overnight, and ordinary American consumers, who felt this burden directly in their weekly shopping rather than in some abstract policy debate, revolted at the ballot box. In the 1890 midterm elections, Republicans who had championed the tariff suffered a stunning wave of losses, including McKinley's own congressional seat. The lesson was unmistakable, even if the political class was slow to fully absorb it. A tax that could be dressed up as protecting American industry still, in the end, hit ordinary families in the one place they always noticed, the register at the local store. By the 1890s, a new political movement was gathering force specifically around this grievance. Populists and, soon after, progressives began making an argument that would eventually topple the entire tariff-funded system, that a tax on imported goods was, by its very nature, deeply unfair to the poor and the working class, who spent a far larger share of their income on basic necessities than the wealthy ever did. A rich man barely noticed a tariff on imported silk. A working family noticed every added penny on flour, cloth, and tools. Tariffs, critics increasingly argued, were a hidden tax that fell heaviest on those who could least afford it, while sparing, almost entirely, the fortunes of the wealthy. In 1894, that argument finally reached Congress in concrete form. Amid a brutal economic depression, Democratic lawmakers passed the Wilson-Gorman Tariff Act, which lowered tariff rates and, in the same bill, imposed something the country had not seen outside of wartime in over 2 decades: a peacetime federal income tax, a modest 2% levy, but only on incomes above $4,000, a sum high enough that it touched only the wealthiest sliver of the population. For the first time since the Civil War, Congress had attempted to shift at least a portion of the government's funding directly onto the fortunes of the rich, rather than onto the prices paid by everyone at the store. The wealthy interests threatened by this shift did not accept it quietly. A legal challenge quickly made its way to the Supreme Court, and in 1895, in a case called Pollock v. Farmers Loan and Trust Company, the court delivered a stunning verdict. By a bare 5-4 majority, the justices ruled that this new income tax was a form of direct tax, and under the Constitution as it stood, any direct tax had to be apportioned among the states according to population, a nearly impossible standard for a tax on individual income to satisfy. The income tax was struck down. Unconstitutional, dead on arrival, only a single year after it was signed into law. Here was the great, forgotten irony sitting at the heart of this story. The country had already recognized, in plain political terms, that its tariff-funded system was unfair, that it quietly punished the poor to spare the rich. And when Congress finally tried to correct that imbalance directly, the nation's highest court slammed the door shut, ruling that the Constitution itself stood in the way. The system that had failed so many Americans for over a century was legally untouchable. If the country truly wanted to change how it funded itself, it would need something far more drastic than an ordinary act of Congress. It would need to rewrite the Constitution itself. That fight would consume the next 2 decades of American political life, and it would ultimately require an amendment, a president willing to gamble his agenda on it, and a quiet Tennessee congressman, almost no one remembers today, whose political maneuvering finally broke a century-old deadlock for good. The Supreme Court's ruling in Pollock did not end the fight over tariffs and taxation. It simply redirected it, away from ordinary legislation and toward the far harder, far slower path of constitutional amendment. For over a decade, that fight found its most persistent champion in an unlikely figure, Cordell Hull, a Democratic congressman from a poor, rural district in Tennessee, a man with none of the wealth or connections typically associated with power in Washington. Hull believed, with something close to religious conviction, that the tariff system was fundamentally unjust, and he spent years quietly building a coalition of progressive Democrats and Republicans willing to support a constitutional amendment allowing Congress to tax income directly without the impossible apportionment requirement that had doomed the 1894 law. The breakthrough came through an unlikely political bargain. In 1909, Hull worked out an arrangement with the sitting Republican president, William Howard Taft. Hull and his allies would not obstruct the passage of a new tariff bill Taft wanted. In exchange, Taft would publicly support both a corporate excise tax and, more importantly, a constitutional amendment granting Congress the explicit power to levy an income tax. It was a trade few would have predicted: a low-tariff Democrat and a Republican president finding common ground on the very issue that had divided their parties for generations. Congress passed the proposed amendment in 1909, sending it to the states for ratification. What followed was a slow, unglamorous process, state legislature after state legislature debating, voting, ratifying, one at a time, over the course of nearly 4 years. And then, on February 3, 1913, just weeks before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration, the 36th state ratified the amendment, meeting the constitutional threshold required. The 16th Amendment was now part of the United States Constitution, granting Congress the explicit, unambiguous power to tax incomes, from whatever source derived, no apportionment required, no Supreme Court loophole left to exploit. That same year, Congress passed the Underwood Tariff, sharply cutting tariff rates for the first time in decades, rates that had remained stubbornly high through nearly the entire span since the Civil War. And in the very same piece of legislation, Congress enacted the nation's first sustained, constitutionally secure federal income tax, a modest 1% levy on individual and corporate income, with a surtax reaching higher rates on the wealthiest Americans. It is difficult to overstate how quietly monumental this moment actually was. In a single year, the financial architecture of the United States government, an architecture that had stood, largely unchanged in its fundamentals, for over 120 years, was replaced. Not through a dramatic single event, but through decades of grinding political struggle, finally converging on one constitutional amendment and one piece of legislation. The full magnitude of this shift did not become fully clear until war forced America's hand. When the United States entered the First World War in 1917, the federal government needed staggering new sums of money to fund the war effort, and it turned, almost instinctively now, to the income tax rather than tariffs. Rates climbed dramatically. Federal receipts from taxation ballooned from under $1 billion in 1917 to nearly $4 billion the following year. By the war's end, roughly 60% of all federal tax revenue came from income taxes alone. The system that had funded the American government for over a century, tariffs collected at the docks, had been almost entirely eclipsed within the span of a single decade, replaced by the very mechanism that had once been ruled unconstitutional less than a generation earlier. Tariffs did not vanish overnight, and they did not vanish without one final catastrophic attempt to reassert their old dominance. That attempt would become one of the most notorious cautionary tales in American economic history, a tariff so aggressive, so poorly timed, that it would help drag the entire world deeper into the worst economic collapse of the 20th century. In June of 1930, as the American economy was already beginning its terrifying slide into what would become the Great Depression, Congress passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, raising duties on more than 20,000 imported goods and pushing the average tariff rate up to somewhere near 46%, among the highest levels in the nation's entire history. The theory, as it had been a century earlier under Hamilton, was that higher tariffs would protect American jobs and American farms from foreign competition. The reality was close to catastrophic. Trading partners around the world, wounded by the sudden wall of American tariffs, retaliated with high tariffs of their own. Canada, Britain, France, Germany, nation after nation slammed its own doors in response, and a genuine global trade war erupted at the worst possible moment. Between 1929 and 1934, international trade collapsed by roughly 60 to 66%. Economists still debate exactly how much of the Great Depression's severity can be laid at Smoot-Hawley's feet, but the broader verdict of history has rarely wavered. The act did not save American industry. It helped strangle global commerce at precisely the moment the world could least afford it. And some historians argue its economic devastation abroad even helped fuel the political extremism that would soon engulf Europe. Smoot-Hawley became, almost instantly, a cautionary tale, proof to an entire generation of American policymakers that reflexively raising tariffs in a crisis could make that crisis dramatically worse. The response came just 4 years later, and it would permanently end tariffs' century-long reign as the primary engine of American public finance. In 1934, President Franklin Roosevelt's Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, the same Tennessee congressman who had helped engineer the constitutional breakthrough 2 decades earlier, persuaded Congress to pass the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act. For the first time, Congress voluntarily handed over a significant piece of its own constitutional authority over tariffs, granting the president the power to negotiate directly with foreign nations, lowering American tariffs by as much as 50% in exchange for reciprocal reductions abroad. Hull, who would later receive the Nobel Peace Prize partly in recognition of this work, saw trade liberalization as something larger than economics, a form of what he called economic disarmament, a way of knitting nations together so tightly through trade that war between them became less thinkable, not more. This is the final revelation at the heart of the entire story. Tariffs were not abandoned because they failed to raise money. For over a century, they had done exactly that, funding an entire growing nation from the docks alone. They were abandoned because America came to see them as fundamentally unfair, a tax that fell hardest on those least able to bear it, while quietly sparing the fortunes of the wealthy, and because one catastrophic experiment in the depths of the Depression proved just how dangerous that old system could become when pushed to its extreme. The consequences rippled forward for the rest of the 20th century. Hull's reciprocal framework became the direct model for an even larger international effort after World War II, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, negotiated in 1947, which brought dozens of nations together in a shared, decades-long project of steadily lowering tariffs worldwide. That agreement would eventually evolve into the World Trade Organization, cementing a global trading order almost unrecognizable from the high-tariff world of the 19th century. Today, tariffs supply only a tiny sliver of the United States government's total revenue, a small fraction of 1% in most years, a rounding error compared to the towering sums generated by individual and corporate income taxes. The system that once funded nearly the entire federal government, that nearly tore a young nation apart 3 decades before its Civil War, that provoked consumer revolts and constitutional crises and a Nobel Peace Prize, now occupies a strange, diminished corner of American economic life. No longer the government's primary paycheck, but still, unmistakably, one of its most politically explosive tools. What most people misunderstand about this history is exactly that diminished status. They assume tariffs have always been a minor background policy lever, a tool for occasional leverage in trade disputes, never the main event. The truth is almost the opposite. For roughly the first 125 years of this nation's existence, tariffs were not a footnote to American government. They very nearly were the American government, its primary source of funding, its most consistent source of political fury, and, for one terrifying winter in 1832 and 1833, the single issue that came closer than almost any other before the Civil War to tearing the Union apart at its seams. The country did not abandon that system because it stopped working. It abandoned it because, after more than a century of watching that system quietly enrich some regions and quietly punish others, America finally decided, through decades of political struggle, a constitutional amendment, a global economic catastrophe, and one determined Tennessee congressman, that there was a fairer way to fund a government. Whether that judgment was correct, and whether the modern tax system that replaced tariffs has actually delivered on that promise of fairness, remains a debate this country is still having, in various forms, more than a century later. So here is the question worth sitting with. For over 100 years, the government you live under funded almost its entire existence through a tax collected at the border, a tax so consequential it nearly broke the Union 3 decades before the Civil War, and so unfair, by the judgment of an entire generation of reformers, that the country rewrote its own constitution to replace it. Should tariffs make a comeback today as a major source of government funding, the way they once were? Or did the shift to income tax actually deliver the fairness it promised? Or simply move the burden somewhere else? Tell us what you think in the comments. Because more than a century after the 16th Amendment, this country still has not fully settled the question of who should pay for its own government. And this is far from the last hidden financial fight buried in America's past. Because there was once a time when the very dollars sitting in an American's pocket were not issued by a single national government at all, when thousands of separate private banks each printed their own paper money, promising a value that no one outside their own small region could ever fully trust, and a merchant might need a thick catalog on his counter just to tell a genuine banknote from an elaborate forgery. How did an entire nation manage to buy, sell, and function when nobody could even agree on what a dollar was actually worth? That story is coming next, and once you understand it, you will never look at the bill in your own wallet quite the same way again.